there's really no better person to talk about collecting photography than Howard Greenberg. American Photography Magazine named him one of the 25 most important people in photography in 1998. He founded the Center for Photography in Woodstock, New York in 1977, but he then left Woodstock to found his own photography gallery in Manhattan in 1986. Howard Greenberg Gallery, and this is not an understatement, is one of the most eminent photography galleries in the country. He represents the estates of Edward Steichen and Imogene Cunningham and Andre Cortez, just as examples. He's also a very well-known source nationally for gorgeous vintage, that is historic, prints of such photo greats as Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Weston and Walker Evans and Henri Cartier-Bresson, and Wichita's own native son, the important photographer W. Eugene Smith. Very recently, and this is just another small measure of his centrality, his importance, he received the exclusive rights to sell the original prints, the photographs from Life magazine, Time magazine, and Fortune magazine. If you can think of all the incredible photographers who were the staff photographers for those magazines. And I especially thought of inviting Howard, of all possibilities and people, because of his connection and our shared connection to Gordon Parks. He was his exclusive last dealer, and he's now an advisor for the Gordon Parks Foundation. And in the past 3 years, our museum has gone from owning 4 prints by Gordon Parks to 25, and we have Howard Greenberg to thank for that. I have 2 other just really important acknowledgments to make, and one is that for anyone who has not met the son of Gordon Parks, David Parks, he is here with us this evening, and we're just delighted to have you back in Wichita and on campus, David. And another really important announcement, when we sent out our annual donor recognition that we do in our fall newsletter every year, we acknowledged a really important patron by the name of Marilyn Stevens. Well, of course, Marilyn is Marnie, and she's up here in the front row, and she gave us great support to acquire our recent cache of Gordon Parks photographs. So we thank her so very generously for that as well. We simply couldn't hear from a more authoritative photography dealer. Please help me to welcome Howard Greenberg to Wichita and to the stage.
Thank you very much. That was the nicest introduction I've ever received. I hope it's all true. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out. I have not been to Wichita before, but I have to tell you, I'm sure that people here in Wichita are at least as friendly and hospitable as some of my old friends in Texas. Definitely much better than New York or Los Angeles. Patricia asked me to perhaps say a few words about Gordon Parks and then talk about this, which really has to do with my own collecting and why I collect pictures and what I collect and how that fits into my career as a photography dealer and all that. But let's talk about Gordon for a moment. I believe, I'm guessing that even if you didn't know him personally, most of you are well aware of Gordon and what a giant of a man he was and accomplished and all that, and native son of Kansas and very special for your community. And I could go on and perhaps tell little stories about Gordon, this and that, but excuse me, I want to indulge you a bit. It's 3 pages, it's double spaced, but I want to read an essay. And this is the essay that my oldest daughter wrote when she was 17, not so many years ago, she's 21 now, in her application to go to college. I'm sure you've heard about college applications. They're pretty important. And it'll give you some idea of what the influence of Gordon on my daughter, but it really extends out to many, many people, myself included. And I thought it might be a nice way to speak about the man. So if you'll indulge me, let me read. She titled it, of course, Moments Without Proper Names. Gordon Parks was born on the 13th of November, 1912. Gordon Parks died on the 7th of March, 2006. He was 93 years old and less than 7 years short of literally living through an entire century. Can you imagine that? Living for 100 years, living through the Great Depression and both world wars, the birth of jazz and the birth of rock and roll, a man walking on the surface of the moon, and all before you turn 70. Even greater, can you imagine leaving behind a majestic legacy of filmmaking, photography, poetry and prose, musical composition, and political activism? If I were to list here the accomplishments of this inexhaustible man, eyes would roll. Remember, these are the words of a 17-year-old girl about Gordon Parks. Such words can only show the membrane of his verve and audacity. No, I won't be reading off a list. His aptitude was infinite. There is nothing I can say to you in this brief time to enlighten you about infinity. Instead, I will tell you of the impression that Gordon has left on my soul. Friction between Teutonic plates of intellect and the uncommon beauty of a funeral. Gordon's death was announced on the day that spring began. My mother told me on the drive back to New York, choking on melancholy as she tried to explain without crying. The funeral, she said, will be on Friday. I will go with your father. At that time, Gordon's last photography exhibition was hanging in my father's gallery. It was titled Moments Without Proper Names. I took the train into the city to view the show the next day. The forecast predicted gray clouds and scattered showers, yet there was not a single cloud in the Manhattan sky. I watched people connect, separate, or collide on my 15-block saunter to the gallery. Most had destinations, but some drifted blindly. In the eyes of the drifters, I caught glimpses of ghosts and wondered why. I was like a bird slipping sideways through the cracks of broken fences. I took flight from the pedestrian traffic and ascended to the 14th floor. My father was being interviewed by an NBC reporter about Gordon. Through the glass door of his office, I saw him remove his glasses and wipe tears from his eyes. I wanted to go to him and hold his hands, but they were filming and I was obliged to stay outside the closed door. I had never seen so many people in the gallery at once. Some stood before the compelling photographs, while others watched a documentary projected on a screen. In between the pictures and the film, excuse me, were quiet conversations about the artist. I was mollified by the force of unspoken understanding inside the gallery. Adhered to one of the walls were the words of a poem by Gordon. And I quote, "Hope is the song I have chosen to sing, a deathless song, flowing steadily beside my faith. Whenever the first of doubt knocks at my door, it is powerfully turned away by my hopeful singing. When things go from bad to worse, I still sing my song. Why not?" With a lump in my throat, I identified the force that filled the negative spaces in the room and smiled. Hope. The funeral was held at Riverside Church in Harlem. David Dinkins, the former mayor of New York, began the service and spoke lovingly about his friend Gordon. Gordon had the greatest gift of all, the ability to love without fear. The pang of his poignant words rippled through the pews of the church. At that moment, and no sooner, I realized that this truism was the great challenge of humanity and committed myself to overcome it just as Gordon did in his lifetime. That's it. My daughter was incredibly inspired by Gordon, and she still speaks of him. And the inspiration that he provided for her, he provided for myself and many, many, many people who he touched. And I guess I'm paying homage to him here in an appropriate place to do that. And perhaps after I talk about the collection, if anybody has any questions about Gordon, my relationship with him, please feel free. Okay, so what you're looking at is the invitation for a show we had, it says right there, in September of 2007. Now, 25 years is a long time. I made it. A few other photography dealers have made it 25 years, and it's a good time to memorialize the occasion. And for a good couple of years before that time, I thought about it, thought about the many ways I could celebrate 25 years, and really couldn't come up with a happy solution. Too many political considerations, too many photographs that I loved, and so on and so forth. And then I finally realized perhaps the best thing I could do would be to make it very personal, very small, perhaps precious, and put together a book of 25 pictures from my own collection, and choose photographs not by necessarily who I represented or the most valuable or even the most famous, but pictures that I could tell stories about, I could write something about, and it might be interesting and meaningful to other people, and do it that way. Culminated in the book in an exhibition in the gallery. Patricia has a copy of the book, and you're welcome to look at it. I'm going to leave one here in the museum. So I really was a collector of everything before I even began to take pictures back in the 70s. Collected baseball cards, you know. It's a gene, and if it's in you, you got it. And sometimes I thought I became a photography dealer just so I could have all these photographs around me, because, you know, from day one, the collector instinct was in me. But I start off the book with this photograph. It's, as we put the information as to the name of the photographer and when it was made, and also the kind of print and when the print was made, which is very important to me. This is an early photograph, just about 100 years old, by a photographer, Carl Struss. He was a member of the Photo Secession, which was an alliance of photographers put together by Alfred Stieglitz around the turn of the century. And for me, Struss is perhaps the earliest modern photographer. Even though this photograph is pictorial, his use of the tree and how it divides up the frame is a very modern technique. And he went on to be a great, actually, cinematographer and filmmaker in Hollywood. But it's the first picture because I had this photograph on consignment from a collector in California, and I was trying to sell it for several months, and as I was trying to sell it, I was falling in love with it more and more and more. It was a very beautiful, very special thing. And one day I made a decent sale and it seemed like I had some extra money, and Sid Avery, the photographer who owned it, called. He said, you know, you've had that picture a long time, maybe you should send it back. And I said, you know what, Sid, I'm going to buy it for myself. And that was huge, because it was $4,000, I will tell you, and it was a long time ago, and I'd never spent anything like that for myself, you know. And I think that's the first moment that I became a serious collector of photography. So that's why we start that way. Now, I will tell you that the way this book evolved and how I, quote, collect pictures, it's a very personal statement. I'm very involved in understanding what it is that motivates people to own a photograph, to buy a photograph, and myself as well. So here's a great example. This is a great, powerful photograph by W. Eugene Smith, who's from Wichita, of course. And the reason this picture came into my collection goes back to when I was a very, very young photographer. I'd come down from Woodstock, and once a month to see the 3 shows that were up in town, and always stop at Museum of Modern Art. And Museum of Modern Art always had and still has a room for its permanent collection of photography. And there were great works in there by all the best photographers, but a print of this picture was there, and it was the one picture that influenced me in a way that no other did. It had so much raw emotion and feeling and darkness and light at the same time. It was, turns out, a typical Gene Smith composition, because all his pictures were very emotional and often dark. But this picture really stayed with me. And this print, well, I had other prints of the photographs and sold them at different times, but this print came out of the Time Life Archive, which Patricia mentioned. I started working with them in 1999, and this is the first print that he made. This print has on the back of it the stamps, many stamps, including the one that says used in life, whatever the date was, 1950. And it's different than the other prints. It looks different, it feels different, it smells different. And I decided to buy that one for myself so I could unify my love for this photograph as well as my interest in the particular print, which was in its way very unique. And that's how this photograph became part of my collection. This next image is called The Powerhouse Mechanic by Louis Hine. Louis Hine, for those of you who don't know, very important, maybe the most important social documentary photographer who was uniquely responsible for creating child labor laws. That was the first important body of his work, photographing kids at work, basically in abusive situations, and through his photographs, Congress created and changed laws. And this is perhaps his most famous picture. It's not a child labor photograph. It's made a wee bit after those, but is a photograph that really is one of the great examples of the modern age. It may remind you of a film, I think it was Fritz Lang's Metropolis. He refers to this image in the film in ways, and it's just considered one of the all-time great perfect photographs. The reason this particular print came into my collection is I worked with a photographer named Arnold Eagle, who was a Hungarian immigrant, and he was part of a group called the Photo League, which existed in New York from 36 to 51, and he knew Louis Hine, and Louis Hine had given him this print, and Arnold was old and starting to sell things, and I was working with him, showing his work, and he asked me one day, you know, if I wanted this print, and I said, are you kidding? And he gave it to me, and it's a beautiful little print, and it turns out that it's really one of the signature pieces in the collection. Here's a photograph by a man named Dave Heath, and the reason this got into the collection, it's not a famous picture. Very few people know it unless you were a photographer in the 1970s and you read Aperture. Aperture is a quarterly, it's still published. They're on their close to 200th, maybe more than 200th copy. But when I was a young photographer, Aperture, when it would arrive, and I'd wait for it to arrive, I would digest it over and over and over, look at the photographs, dwell on them, read everything. And this particular picture was the cover of one of the Apertures, one of the issues of Aperture. And I'll never forget it because it taught me something about what photography could be and what photography was. And after seeing this picture, I had it in mind that photography was really about light. Sounds obvious, but it's true. It's about light, and it's about light giving, and it's about light taking. And obviously in this picture, it's the way the light hits the glasses that makes it so wonderful. But then it's more than that. It's her posture, it's the way she's in a certain reverie. You don't quite know what's going on, and I love the effect of this picture. I like emotional photographs. I like photographs that are about people. And it seemed to have everything, all the potential of what a photograph could be, and it influenced me greatly. And years later, I got to work with Dave Heath, and he had only 2 prints of this picture. And I actually bought the first one from him and put it up in my exhibition, one of my exhibitions of his work. And the curator from the National Gallery in Washington decided that was the one photograph she wanted to buy from the show for her collection. So with great, great trepidation, I sold it to her because I didn't want to turn down the curator of the National Gallery. And then I got back in touch with Dave. I said, Dave, I had to sell it. Can't you find another one? He said, well, I don't think I have another one. And lo and behold, he found another one. One more. And that's the one that's in my collection now. So, this next photograph, excuse me, Walker Evans. Walker Evans, of course, was one of the truly not just great, but influential photographers of the 20th century. There are many books about Walker Evans. I think he influenced seeing and thinking and visual literacy as much as any other person. And I always had an affinity for this picture because it's taken in Coney Island. And I grew up in Brooklyn, very close to Coney Island, and I spent many, many days on the beach of Coney Island as a kid, and I never did get to see Luna Park, which this was made of, my day it was Steeplechase Park. But that's one reason. More than that, Walker Evans is probably the greatest formalist photographer. The construction of a picture, the elements coming together. Nobody really did it better than Walker Evans, and this picture is typically wonderful in that way, how he uses the the lines in the top of the picture and the structure in the center, and positions the couple not in the middle of the picture but in the low left. It has so much going for it, and this was the print that was actually in his seminal exhibition called American Photographs, which was at Museum of Modern Art in 1938. And I was very lucky to come across this one print of it, and it got into my collection. I love the 19th century for photography. I don't have very many 19th century photographs in my collection, but again, the idea for me of a collection that has deep meaning for the collector is one where everything in it has a personal reason, a personal point of view, gives it meaning. And of course, not so unusually, I had children, and when the kids were young, I noticed myself being attracted to photographs of children. I always wanted a Julia Margaret Cameron photograph. She was truly one of the great photographers, not just of the 19th century, but of all time. And I looked at many of them, but for one reason or another, I could never find one that I wanted to keep. But then I came across this picture, and one of my kids was about that age when I found it, and I love it. And again, not just because of the kid, but as a photograph, it's amazing. The mother, ghost-like figure there, but not there, allowing the child to be itself, alone with its dreams and perhaps dreaming of the mother. It really has wonderfully complex elements to it. And in a photograph made in 1865, that's extraordinary. Photography was very primitive at that point. So for all those reasons, it's there. Another kind of photograph. This one, right? Pretty famous picture. Many of you might know it. This is interesting. There are many prints of this photograph. It was Ruth Orkin, photographer who I knew. It was her most famous, popular picture, and she sold, I'd be shocked if it was anything less than 100, 150, 200 prints of this photograph. But there was one print, an original vintage print about that big, which I became aware of a long time ago in the early 80s. This private dealer had it, and she promised that if she ever sold it, she would let me know. And I was doing a small Photographic Historical Society fair, and I found out that in a rush she came in looking for me. She needed to sell it. She couldn't find me, so she sold it to a competitor. Now that competitor, fortunately, his friend, was very happy to have it. And I said to him, Henry, I said, if ever you're going to sell that picture, you got to promise me on a stack that I'll get the first offer. And I love him for it. True to his promise, many years later, I'm going to say probably 15 years later, we were doing a Ruth Orkin show, and Henry came to me and said, well, I want to sell the picture now. I said, well, how much do you want? And he named an ungodly price. It was really way above what I thought it would be, but I paid it. I said, Henry, I'm going to do it because I've been after this picture for so many years. I don't care what it costs. You got me. And that's why that print of this picture is in my collection. Something else to talk about with this photograph that's wonderful. It's one of a handful of photographs. I think I have another one in the presentation like that, where it's always intrigued people. The question of, is this really going on? Is this an actual photograph of a moment, or was it staged? Was it created? And because it's too perfect, right? Something like this couldn't happen. But the truth lies somewhere in between, which is that Ruth was working with this model. Her name is Jinx, and she's still around. She's amazing. And they were in Florence, and they were taking pictures all over the place. It was an assignment for Holiday magazine. And what Ruth asked Jinx to do was to walk down that street. She saw all the guys lined up. And so what happened was set up, but it actually happened at the same time. At least that's what I always thought. Turns out the guy on the motor scooter, who looks like one of the guys who are ogling her, shows up in about 7 or 8 different pictures in different parts of town. So Ruth never admitted it, but she really did stage this photograph, okay? But don't tell anybody, you know, kill the whole myth. Yeah, he was. I think he liked the model. Okay, this is a photograph from the FSA period, the Farm Securities Administration, which was a government organization during the Depression, and employed some of the greatest photographers who ever lived in that period: Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Ben Shahn, several others. And in fact, Gordon Park's first job for the government, he was hired by Roy Stryker, who started up the FSA a few years before he met Gordon. Anyway, this is Dorothea Lange, and for me, this is a well-known image. It's in all her books, but it's always published cropped. You could see the part of the man's face on the left, just at the edge of the film in the upper left. Well, in all the photographs of it, if you put your hand up and he's not there, it becomes an entirely different picture. It's much more symbolic. It's full of all kinds of interesting meaning, and there's a lot to read into it anyway. But when I saw this print, the uncropped version, it changes the entire meaning, because what's going on is this guy's really talking to Paul Taylor, Dorothea Lange's husband, who's traveling around with her, and they're just having a conversation. So it's not that big a deal what's going on, and I love the idea that photography tells the truth and photography doesn't tell the truth. Photography is in the eye and mind of the photographer to interpret what they're photographing, and then, you know, in the eye and mind of the viewer to take out of it what they want. And the simple little cropping made a big deal. So I kept this picture for my collection. I found that very interesting. Okay, we go across the river, across the ocean, excuse me, to Czechoslovakia. Alongside with my ever-growing love for American 20th century photography is a strong affinity for photography that was made in primarily Czechoslovakia, Hungary too, but primarily Czechoslovakia between the wars. In the 20s and 30s, they had an incredibly active art scene in Czechoslovakia. The new modernism, modern way of thinking and seeing was infused there, and there were several incredible Czech photographers who made pictures like this. Always very dark, well, not always very dark, but brooding, emotional, light, shadow, and human, sometimes without humans. In the abstraction, you get a lot of feeling, and I don't see that in the abstract photographs, the modern photographs made in other places by other photographers in the same way that you get it in Czechoslovakia. And the prints are gorgeous. I mean, the most beautiful, luscious objects to behold. So this is one of them, and it's one of my favorite pictures in the collection. This is another one. This is a photographer named František Dritikol. And Dritikol, I've had a lot of experience with. We did 2 shows over the years. His prints were called pigment prints. I wish I had one to show you. They're really amazing. You have not seen photographs that look this way. They're so. And Dritticoll worked with nudes, often dancers, that came to his studio, and he built these sets, these stage sets with geometric objects, balls and steps like that, and all kinds of things. And was really quite prolific and amazing. And I've been working with his photographs for years. This was one, again, I had it with a group during a show, and I loved it, and I had a client who wanted it, and put it on hold, and days went by and weeks went by. The show was over. I could have sold it 10 times. I didn't. I waited. And, in the meantime, I'm loving this picture so much. I said, you got to do. So sure enough, he said, I can't do it. I'm not going to buy it. And I said, great. I'm taking it home. And I've had it ever since. And it was the best thing I ever did, because it turned out a Czech historian who I know was doing a book on Dritticoll, and he's the foremost authority on this photographer. And he looked for another print of this picture in every collection in Czechoslovakia, wherever he can go. And it turned out that it's truly unique, and he used it on the cover of the book because he thought it was so great. So I was really happy to have kept that one. Patricia mentioned I represent the estate of Edward Steichen. I do, and it's probably the best thing that ever happened in my career, but it wasn't easy because his widow, Joanna Steichen, who was some 60 years younger, was a famously difficult woman, and nobody knew that she really had anything, because when Steichen died in 1973, her job was to give everything away to museums. And I was alerted by a mutual friend that she had some prints left, and I don't know, over a 2-year period, we finally met. I saw some things. She tested me out. Well, here's a box. I have these pictures. You can try and sell 1 or 2. Let's see how you do. And it was like walking on eggshells. But at the end, we agreed to work with each other. And I put on an exhibition at the same time. The Whitney Museum did a retrospective show. And it was wildly successful. And Joanna was very happy. And she was happy with the show. And we just had the best relationship after that. And this particular Steichen says a lot about the period between World War II, when he was in France, and coming to New York to work for Condé Nast in 1923. I don't know if this is going over everyone's head because you don't even know who Edward Steichen is, but he's one of the truly most important famous photographers who's ever lived, and influential in many ways. He was, amongst many things, he was the curator of the Family of Man show when he was older, and curator of photography at Museum of Modern Art. Anyway, this picture typifies his avant-gardism, his thinking ahead of the curve. He made very personal and very, very modern photographs beginning in 1915, when very few photographers comprehended thinking that way. One of them, by the way, was Paul Strand, and you have a similar picture with similar ideas hanging outside on the wall, called Wall Street, and that was actually made in 1916. But this print is really beautiful, and again, it was the only one in Joanna's collection. I had never seen another one on market, so I bought it and used it as a frontispiece in my book. And another Edward Steichen. This one's not in my book, but I couldn't resist putting it in the slideshow. That's his portrait of Gloria Swanson, 1924, as it says. And I dare say it may be the greatest, or at least the most effective portrait ever made. It's powerful. People see this picture and they generally don't forget it. The reasons, I believe, are obvious. It never grows tired, and it costs a lot of money. Not just that one. I mean, I've sold a couple of other prints of it since. It's amazing. Okay. Another one of the really, truly marvelous photographers was Eugene Atget. He photographed in Paris very quietly on his own from the turn of the century until he died in the late 20s. This is a classic Atget. It's on the Seine. It's atmospheric. It's a beautiful picture. He also photographed store windows and mannequins and things like that. And the surrealists in the 20s picked up on Ache and made him somewhat of their hero. He was completely unknown before that. This picture has meaning to me because, again, it was one that came into the gallery. I loved it, but I had a client and he bought it. It was expensive then. That same client showed up years later and was not interested in his photographs anymore. He was now collecting contemporary Chinese art. He was very smart. He was doing that some years ago and then sold his whole collection in an auction and made millions. But he wanted to sell this picture and a couple of others he bought for me. And I said, Harold, I've dreamed about that picture since I sold it to you. I'll buy it back. And I paid him twice what he paid me. And again, it was a crazy high price, but I didn't want to let it go twice. Maybe you can see why. It's really quite beautiful. And this photograph, which is actually leaving my collection, it's a great, important picture by Henri Cartier-Bresson. There was just a mega retrospective at Museum of Modern Art last year of his work. And Cartier-Bresson was really a surrealist with a camera when he started in the late 20s. And this picture has become a real classic. It's a most loved photograph, and you could see what's going on. I mean, the guy looks like he's, well, you don't know if he's walking on water or if he's about to fall in the water or whatever it is, but it's classic Cartier-Bresson. His thing, what he's known for, term he coined was the decisive moment. And he's become really the father of modern photojournalism. Without Cartier-Bresson, people would not see with a camera the way they have ever since. Now this print I bought, and I'm sorry because you can't tell so much from the reproductions. If had it in front of you, you could see the print and you get a different sense of it. But this is a print I bought at a furniture auction house in New York City downtown, where they disperse the contents of apartments and things like that. And I was alerted that there were 2 Cartier-Bresson prints, must have been hanging on the walls in someone's apartment. And so I went down and I bought this one for $1,100. And it had, on the back, it had the stamp of Beaumont Newhall. Beaumont Newhall wrote a book called The History of Photography, and it was sort of the standard for the history of photography for years and years and years. He wrote it in 1937 as curator at Museum of Modern Art. And so I knew it had a pretty good provenance, and I bought it and I liked the print, and I had it ever since. Very recently, I did a show of vintage and early prints by Cartier-Bresson, and I brought this one in to put on the wall, not for sale, it's in my collection. And Martine Frank, Cartier-Bresson's widow, who is a good friend and I actually represented with doing a show this year of her work, came in and she saw the print. She said, wow, that's a beautiful print. What's the story? And I told her the story, and I told her about the stamp, and her eyes opened up. She said, that's probably one of the first prints he ever made of it. In fact, it could be the first print. We have one like that in the foundation, but it's a mess. It's all damaged and whatnot. This is the only time I've ever seen a print like that. And then, I don't know, a few days later, she emailed me. She said, we really want to have it for the foundation. How much do you want? What do you do, right? I'm very close with Martina, very close with the foundation. I don't want to say no to anything they ask of me, but I didn't want to give her this photograph, especially knowing what she had just told me, right? Well, I'm a softie. We negotiated and whatnot, and it's now on its way to the foundation. They have no money, so we're trading for other photographs, but I hate to give it up, but sometimes you have to. This is, again, an early modern vision of Margaret Burke White, who became very famous as a Life magazine photographer. And I'm interested in Margaret Burke White for many reasons, but one of them is that she was one of the attendees at the Clarence White School of Photography, which was founded by Clarence White, who was a pictorialist. He was in that Stieglitz group. And, but in his school, he really taught the first wave of photographers the new modernism, the new idea in photography. And he had people like Max Weber, the painter, teaching there, and other people who were teaching all these new ideas in art to the photographers. So you get this moment where pictorialism and beautiful printmaking and warm, you know, Salon type papers are used to make these kind of modern, industrial, Art Deco influenced images. And this is Margaret Burke-White's first assignment as a young professional photographer for the Otis Steel Company, which was in, if I'm not, it was in Ohio. I think maybe it was Cleveland. And it's not a well-known one. It's reproduced in one book, but it's it just typifies all the best of that genre of photography. Okay, back to the FSA. Dust Storm, Cimarron County, Oklahoma. Not too far from here, I guess. But there were two photographs made during the FSA period that have become famous and in its time really told a certain story. And this is one. It's by Arthur Rothstein. This particular print is a vintage exhibition print. It's on a different paper than the typical glossies that the government handed out in those days. And you know, it's just a very evocative, beautiful photograph and has a lot of meaning. Different sort of picture, again, back to Europe. I've been working with Roman Vishniac's daughter. Roman Vishniac was a photographer originally from Poland, and he's really the only photographer who widely documented Eastern Europe just before the Holocaust, and then he escaped and came here. But this is perhaps his most famous picture. I had seen many, many later prints made in the 1970s and 1980s of Vishniac's work in this picture, and it's an admirable image. It's really, well, it's sad and tragic, but it's a really beautiful photograph. And then one day in the old gallery, around 1987 or 88, a man walked in, and he was kind of a strange man, and he was somewhat disheveled with a thick accent, and he had an envelope, and in the envelope he had a small stack of small prints that were trimmed originally with a scissor. You could see very uneven, and he asked me if I would be interested in buying them, and they were all pictures by Roman Vishniac. He said that, well, these things were left in Europe underground and they were dug up. And I believed him because there was mold growing on. I mean, they were miserable conditions, just like they had been buried in the soil for years and years and years. And in those days, pictures came in strange ways. There weren't so many photography galleries, and people had photographs, you know, they just come and try and sell them. And if it was interesting, we just buy them. I'm a little more careful now about title and ownership and things like that. But there was this print, this little print, and I held it in my hand, and it was almost like electricity, the connection, the authenticity of this print, of this image, and the connection to it was something I hadn't experienced before, even though I had seen many, many sign-mounted, nice-looking recent prints of this picture. So, I had it conserved, I had it cleaned up, got rid of the mold of many colors. And it's been home ever since. It's really quite extraordinary, small thing. It's about this big. Okay, I mentioned Coney Island. Well, there was this photographer named Ouija. His real name was Arthur Fellig, but he was kind of an ambulance chaser, an accident chaser, and the cops, the New York City police, wondered why he was always there before them, and they all kind of knew each other, and they coined the term Ouija for him, like he had a Ouija board, and had some mystical connection to all these murders and accidents and things that he typically photographed. But one day on July 4th, he went to, it doesn't say in the title, but it was July 4th, and he went to Coney Island, and he made some photographs from the boardwalk above there, and apparently everyone in Coney Island knew this was going on. And thousands of people posed for Ouija. This is actually not the famous version. The famous version is is horizontal, and you could see the parachute jump in the background, which is just cut off. But this version is a real vintage print. Again, I found it in the Time Life archive. It was published, and it's the only version, this cropping, that I've ever seen like this. So I thought that's kind of cool. It's unique, and it's got all. It's a great picture to look at close because you look at all the faces, and you really wonder. So, okay. This is another well-known photograph. It's made by Robert Capa. There's a lot of mythology about these pictures Capa made during D-Day in Normandy. And I have to tell you, I'm not really a history buff per se, but I've learned a lot of history through these photographs and a different kind of appreciation of our history. And this photograph was in the Time Life archive. There were 6 original vintage prints from the original negative of the Normandy invasion. And in my world, it's become famous that there are no original prints because the negatives for these pictures were ruined in the lab when they were being printed, and they never survived. So all the prints that have come out in the world, this being the most famous one of D-Day, were all made from copy negative. Well, it turns out this is the print that the copy negative was made from. And what makes it so wonderful is, for me, Robert Capa's biographer was a man named Richard Whalen, and Richard Whalen had been kind of on a holy grail search for this print because many, many people had come forth and said they were the guy in the photograph. He'd been searching for this person in the photograph. And because of all the copy prints, the face was more obscured. You couldn't really tell. And when Richard saw this print, he absolutely had a bird. He said, it's him. It's this guy who lives in Washington. He's alive. And then they invited him to a big Robert Capa show at ICP. This was about 3 years ago. And everybody was celebrating. It was really quite wonderful. So I didn't realize all this when I bought the print for myself, but it's just got a great story that goes with it. Now, I made an image of the back of it. Many of the photographs in the Time Life archive were used. They were used in various ways and put in a file and taken out. They're usually not in very good condition because of that. They're artifacts more than fine art. But this is a typical reverse of those photographs. This is the back of the one I just showed you. And the important stamp is the one on the far right, that's turned vertically, excuse me. It says, used in life, November 5th, 1945, overseas edition. That's an original stamp. With that stamp, you know that that's the original print that was made and used in the magazine. And it's kind of fun, you know, to have that attached to a photograph. Again, it's a piece of history, and I like that. Okay, so the war's over, and Gene Smith makes perhaps his most memorable, and there are several memorable photographs that Gene Smith made, but this one called The Walk to Paradise Garden was his ode to optimism. You know, it's the war's over, we're coming out of the darkness into the light, and it's a picture as sort of sentimental as it is. It's never worn thin in terms of its you know, the feeling in it, and how people relate to this picture. I really love it. And again, this print wound up in my collection because Smith was an extraordinary printer in the darkroom, but he used to labor over each and every print. And he came to make copy negatives of all his famous photographs because he couldn't take the time in the darkroom to make prints to meet the demand during the 1970s, once his pictures began to really sell and the market developed. So he probably made 100 prints of this picture in different sizes, but all from copy negatives, and all the detail of the foliage that goes all around, and even, you know, close to the kids is gone. It's all black. But this picture was made from the original negative early enough. It's circa '59 because it's a print that he gave to an attorney in trade that he was working with at the time. And it's really quite beautiful and quite different than virtually all of the prints I've ever seen with the pictures, so it fit into my collection for that reason. And staying with Coney Island, staying with post-war optimism, This picture was made by a guy named Sid Grossman, who was the teacher at the Photo League and is considered, along with the Russian art director Alexei Brodovich, the two most influential photographers, teachers in New York City at that time. And a lot of great photographers came out of New York City right after the war. And he did some wonderful work in Coney Island where he changes things. He cuts off heads, arms are going in and out of the frame. And that was really a new way of seeing. It wasn't the classic composition that had been prevalent before then. So Grossman really influenced the way photographers saw, as well as he made these wonderfully joyous pictures in Coney Island. And another post-war photographer who I've worked with, now I work with his daughter, Ted Krona. His influence was Brodovich, the other person I mentioned. Alexei Brodovich was a photographer, but more importantly, an art director. And he was the art director for Vogue and other Condé Nast publications at the time. And he would invite young, promising photographers to his class. It was called the Design Lab. And at the same time, his students were Irving Penn and Richard Avedon and a couple other very famous pictures. And Brodovich used to say his buzzword was astonish me. Do something different, astonish me. And Ted went to Times Square where he photographed light coming at the camera against something photographers really hadn't done at that time because it's the wrong way to take a picture. But he did that and made it work. And this is a great example where the light's silhouetting this figure during the great blizzard of 1947, and when my cousin was born. And I love it. I love the figure. She's floating in the original print. It's a beautiful print, and has a very special quality to it. You may have noticed this was in the middle of the invitation. This is truly one of my favorite pictures that I've ever seen. Consuelo Kanaga was a West Coast person who came to New York and married a painter named Wallace Putnam. And she was in the Photo League, but she had this trip in Tennessee in 1948, and she made maybe a half a dozen pictures like this, beautiful, memorable pictures. But this was always my favorite, and years before I had borrowed a very small print of it to go along with the show in the Photo League, and it was a cover of the catalog for that show. The owner wouldn't sell the print. That's happened before. I wanted it terribly, but for years and years after, I was on the lookout for another print of this picture, and I got a call from a friend in Martha's Vineyard who had a gallery, and said a woman, very old woman, walked in, and she was a friend of Consuelo Kanaga. She's got these two photographs. She wants to sell them. They're a lot of money. It's always a lot of money when you want it. And I was able to buy this print, which is a beautiful exhibition print, much larger. And I can tell you, it was the hit of the show that we had then. It's really a very striking picture. By now, you probably could imagine why I like it so much, with the qualities in it, how it makes you feel. And little humor, Irving Penn, of course, is one of the greats and most desirable of all the photographers worldwide right now in the market. His pictures are really selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he made this picture also early on in his career, and I'm a baseball fan, as many of us are, and I couldn't resist it. I just thought it was, and it's a small print, it's not big. Usually Irving Penns are very large, but I just loved the picture and the fact that it was by Penn, so it came home with me. This picture has another story. This print is about this big. Do you know this picture? Have you? Yeah, it's a famous one. What's interesting about this photograph, of course, is that on the canvas, you see he's painted the cats, and the cats look on the canvas exactly like they are flying through the air. And it makes it sort of impossible and surreal. Well, I worked with the family of Philip Halsman, and we did a show of his dolly photographs. And they pulled this one print out, and it was a vintage print, beautiful, early, large print. And, you know, I was working with it and looking at it and looking at it, and I came to realize that the only way, they told me it was the master that all the other the copy negative was made and all the other prints were made from. And they came to realize that there was something wrong with this picture. And what was wrong with it was that the blacks and whites in the canvas were different than the rest of the picture. Then it hit me over the head. Oh, I know why. This photograph was originally made with a blind canvas. And they threw the cats through, in the air. And they did it over and over. These poor cats were just thrown with the water about 20 times. And I've seen the contact sheet to prove it. And, but they liked the way the cats were in this picture. So Dolly took the print, the master print, and he painted with pen and ink, drew in the cats as they were flying in the air on this print that I had. So I wound up buying it. I said, I got to have this thing. This is crazy. And now I have this print, which is a Philippe Holzman photograph and a Salvatore Dali drawing. It's really quite amazing to see it together. Yeah. I guess when I put these pictures together, I was thinking of the sort of lightness of being post-war in the world. And there are wonderful photographers who lived in Paris primarily, or French photographers in general, who worked after the war in the 40s and 50s. Always like French film, about life and slices of life, often with a gentle touch. And Robert Doisneau was one of the greats of that ilk of photographers, very often with his wonderful sense of humor in what he photographed. And this is one of his famous pictures. And well loved, you can see what's going on. And this particular print is a small vintage print used in life. I found that one in the archive also. The archive's been very prolific for me. And it's a good one. Bruce Davidson is one of the great post-war photo essayists, very much influenced by Cartier-Bresson and Gene Smith. And his first great body of work was he hung out with this gang in Brooklyn for many months and photographed them. They got used to him. And this one I particularly like because the first thing is when I was in high school in Brooklyn, we had a little fraternity house basement, and it had, I think it was the exact same wallpaper. So that was the first thing that got me about it. I love the two photographs in one. You have kids sitting around, which reminded me of when you wanted to ask someone to dance, but you were afraid to, wallflower, and you sit down, you wait. And then you just walk around the wall, and there's this other couple kissing, and I just love that he has that all in one photograph, and you could tell, legions of stories about it, and it never grows tired. Harry Callahan, well known in Chicago. He was one of the great teachers at the Institute of Design. One of his, excuse me, very popular loved and desirable pictures. This particular print is not vintage, but it's an early print. It shows much more of the lake. As Callahan got older and printed this, it got more and more contrasting. So the separation between the white snow on the bottom and the lake is hardly noticeable. It's almost all white, which is nice. But this is an earlier print. There's a little more detail in it. It's a different style of seeing it. And that appealed to me, so I wound up with this print. And Arnold Newman, another one of the great photographers, known for his portraits. He's one of the great, people coined the term environmental portraiture because of Arnold Newman. Famous pictures are Stravinsky at the piano, perhaps you've seen that, or Picasso's face. Anyway, Arnold really made some wonderfully more abstract, I wouldn't call this abstract, but different kinds of photographs when he was young, just out of art school. And I always thought this was just a beautiful example of seeing, pure seeing. He's walking by a music shop and he sees this wall of violins and sees how the light is hitting it. Makes a very simple, straightforward photograph. But it's really becomes quite beautiful and timeless and a very easy picture to look at over and over. And okay, so my next show in the gallery is this photographer, Leon Levenstein, who is really the greatest of the New York post-war photographers who's not very well known. And Leon had a propensity to either stretch people out or compress them with a normal camera, not with a wide angle or telephoto lens. And the only thing I could tell you is if you're in New York after the third week of October, you must come into the gallery and see this guy's work because it'll knock your socks off. He really is a powerful, strong, unique photographer, and this is one of his great pictures. Okay. I included at the end, we're almost done, 2 photographs by Gordon Parks. I actually have Gordon Parks in my collection also. But the 2 that are here, this one and the next, are really not known pictures. I don't even know if they're published. But perhaps from the other photographs, you could see why this one would appeal to me. I think, I'm not 100% positive, I think it was made during his first life essay on Harlem. And he's coming out of a subway up the stairs, and this woman is there with her cup, and it's really a beautiful picture. You know, again, it's about light and shadow and gesture and possibilities and all kinds of things that aren't really literal, but are there embodied in the way he saw it and the way it was printed. And I really quite love this picture, even though it's totally unknown. And the last one, of course, his photographs of Ali are memorable. I think Ali sweating is hanging somewhere not far from here. When Gordon found the box with all the Ali photographs, and there were quite a few because he had photographed them twice for Life magazine, there were a number of really fine pictures that I had never seen before. And then I came across this one, and I thought, wow, this picture really has it, and it has something different than all the rest. It just really got to me. So I bought this one from Gordon, and now it's part of my collection. And that is it. Okay. Well, I hope I kept you awake. I can't see your eyes because of the light, so I'm just assuming most of you stayed awake most of the time. But at the least, I hope you enjoyed seeing a lot of great pictures. And, my stories, I hope they didn't bore you. But please, if you have any questions about photographs, about my gallery, about Gordon, please feel free to ask. Okay? Yeah.
Where'd your daughter go to college?
Well, with that essay, she went to Colorado College. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember which ones. That's why I'm Patricia. I handle so many. I'm forgetting. Are they the ones upstairs? You know better than I. I'm really sorry. I don't remember specifically what the prints looked like, which prints they were of those images. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was a vintage print?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a print that, if it's what we call a vintage print, it would have been one that was made at Time Life in the labs where all of Gordon's pictures were printed while he was with Life magazine. And I should tell you a little story. When all these years I've been working with Life magazine, they own all the photographs in their archive, and they're very possessive of all the photographs made by staff photographers that they had a contract with. And they've been very, very possessive about those photographs. Except with Gordon Parks. See, Gordon at some point expressed some desire to have some of the pictures back. And the story I was told, not by Gordon, but by people at Time Life, was that they all loved Gordon so much that they decided to gather up all his pictures and not tell the bosses and the higher-ups, and they just gave everything back to Gordon. So he had virtually all the pictures that should have been in the files by Time Life. They just gave them back to Gordon. And that might be one of those prints. Yes.
Where is your gallery?
Question is, where is my gallery? Presently, we're located on Madison Ave, in the corner of Madison Avenue and 57th Street, in the Fuller Building, that wonderful Art Deco building with lots of other galleries. So come on up when you're in town, okay? All right, great. Thank you very much. Okay. Might be one of the, 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 might be one of the 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 might be one of the